Well, hey everybody, good morning. The lights are on the stage, so that means the tech guys want us to get started. If you guys want to grab one last cup of coffee and some rolls and fruit, find a chair. We're really excited for today. My name is Aaron Acey. I'm the executive pastor here at Calvary Christian Church, and on behalf of the church, our staff, and those that attend here, welcome to Calvary Bellevue North. This is the Bellevue North campus. We're really excited to have you guys here. And we're honored to be able to host an event like this. And today we're co-hosting the event with Nebraska Christian College. And so I want to give Dustin an opportunity to tell you a little bit more about them.
Good morning, everybody. If you are still looking for a seat, there are a few more down here. You do have to sit by Dr. Krause, but I think that that'll be an enjoyable conversation for you. There's a few more over here as well. But thank you guys for coming. And we are absolutely thrilled to be able to just get together. This is a great turnout. This does my heart well. If you happen to need a refresher packet on NCC, you guys are our best recruiters. The conversations that we have with our students say most of the time when a student comes in, it's because a pastor has had a conversation with them. And maybe there's someone in your life that you can have that conversation with about going into ministry, one of those I see in you conversations to encourage them. We've got those in the back afterwards, and we'd love for you to take one.
Awesome. Well, today we're talking about depression in ministry. And it wasn't long ago I was having a conversation with a pastor who I love and respect and has mentored me a lot. And often we get in a room and we just get to talk face-to-face about real-life things. And it's things like, how's your family? But the question that was asked is, how are you doing? And sometimes we have a tendency to just glance that off and say, oh, we're doing great. You know, my family's great and something awesome is happening. And, you know, my kid's getting a tooth and that sucks a little bit and whatever. But, you know, our relationship is that of which we can be real with each other. And I said, well, how are you doing? And, you know, he said, well, I'm okay. And I said, yeah, me too. I'm not doing that great, actually, this week. And it was through that conversation that he shared with me. He's like, man, I can't find the joy. And I feel like I'm living with a constant low-grade depression in my life. And that seems to be a pretty common theme. You know, the studies are out there. You guys know the research of how many people enter ministry and how many people finish their career in ministry. And the first one is a lot higher than the last. And so if you're in this room and you're part of ministry, you're in it with us. You're just like me. You're just like Dustin. You're just like Dr. Alexander. We're in this thing together. And we've got to support each other, but it's a really important topic. And so when a couple months ago, Dr. Alexander and the staff out at Nebraska Christian said, hey, we've been developing a seminar. It's called Ministry and Depression. We'd like to do it here in Omaha. We said, absolutely. We'll do whatever we can to make that happen. We'll invite people. We'll get people here. We'll have a room, and we'll make it happen. And so this is important to us as a church. I think it's also important to you because you gave up part of your morning to be here and hear about it. And so this is going to be great. Quick housekeeping, there is going to be a question and answer period of time after the seminar is over. And so Dustin will be running around with the microphone. If you would, just raise your hand if you have a question. Wait till Dustin gets there with the microphone. We are streaming for those that couldn't make it here on site today. And so for their sake, to be able to hear your question and then the response, wait till the microphone gets into your hand. So I was thinking about what to say and how to introduce Dr. Alexander. And it's hard. There's so many great things that can be said. He's been part of Hope International University for 25 years. He has degrees in church growth and preaching. He has degrees in marriage and family therapy. As someone who grew up with a mother who spent her whole life researching family strengths, I have a ton of respect for that. That's an area that can never have enough research and devotion. And then lastly, organizational leadership. And so when it comes to things like depression and ministry, I don't think there's anybody that could probably blend those three areas together better than someone that knows about that. So I was really wrestling. I kept saying, well, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? And yesterday afternoon, I kind of like, man, I'm walking out to the mailbox and I'm still just fretting. And so I walked out to the mailbox. I said, God, give me a sign. What am I going to say? Like, how am I going to talk? And there it was, a picture with a magazine with Dr. Alexander's picture on it. That was great. All joking aside, we're really excited to welcome Dr. Paul Alexander to hear about depression and ministry.
I would pay a lot of money to make all those magazines go away. Hey, it is great to be with you today. So this topic is close to my heart for several reasons. One of the reasons I'll tell you about at the end of our time together today is my own story of what happened to me in my 20s, and I'll tell you why I didn't start telling that story until a year ago. So it was a year ago, just about 13 months ago, that I got a call from a pastor from my church, Eastside Christian, and he said, "Hey, did you hear about what happened in Riverside?" I said, "No, what happened?" He said, "I just got word from a friend who's on staff at a church in Riverside. One of their young superstar pastors took his own life yesterday." And you may have heard that one. Andrew Stockline, the news went national. And then over the next few months, 2 other pastors just in my area, in Southern California, 2 young pastors were in so much pain and in so much discomfort that they chose to end their lives. So in social science, we have something called a contagion, which is where in a selected population, a bunch of things happen all at once. So in our area, Southern California, for the world of pastors, which is a small community, it's a big deal and a really problematic question that we ask: what's happening to pastors? Why 3 in one area in such a short period of time? So when the first one happened, I reached out to my pastor, Gene Apple, who some of you may have heard of, a well-known speaker. I texted Gene and I said, "Hey, I have notes on this because I've been doing work behind the scenes with churches of alums, our alums, for a long time. And when a pastor has a difficult time, I will come alongside the church behind the scenes and help find referrals, help with hospitalization if the pastor needs to go in the hospital, and get them connected to resources." So I've been doing that kind of quietly behind the scenes for years and keeping notes on that. So I said to Gene, I have notes and I have some ideas on a seminar. Would you want me to pull those together? And he said, "Absolutely, come as quickly as you can." So it was a year ago that I went to our staff of about 70 at our church, and I did this seminar and just asked God to do with it what he would do. And so doors have just been opening. So as of today, we will have talked to over 1,300 pastors in the last 12 months. And my experience with that has been overwhelmingly positive in the sense that the material seems to matter. It seems to be a good time to be learning about ministry and depression. And what I want to say now and at the very end is that depression is very treatable. We just have to be open. We just have to be open. So let's spend a minute in prayer, invite the Lord to walk with us for the next 50 minutes or so, and then get at it, okay? Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for this group that gave up time to be here. Lord, I ask that the words in my heart and mind would be woven together in a way that we can hear and understand them well. Lord, I pray for just a sense of comfort and ease for people that are a little anxious right now. Help us to relax into this topic, God. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, if you would go ahead and advance the slide for me. So you have in front of you a survey on white paper. I'd like you to do 2 things, number 1 and number 2. So if you have a pen, if you would respond to a single word answer when you hear the word depression. We're collecting these at the end to add to our research base. The first one is just the first word you think of when you hear the word depression. You can use a dash if you have to, a slash, but try to do one word. And then the second one is to take a guess at what the answer is to the percentage of Americans who are clinically depressed today. So you've got 4 chances there. So number 1 is a single word, and number 2 is a number you're going to guess at. So I'm going to force you to pick one of the numbers because we're going to vote by raising our hands in a second. So pick one. Take your best guess. One of the things we're doing is assembling all this research into what we hope becomes both a research article and a popular level article in the next 12 months or so we can publish the results of what we're finding, because there's not enough good information on this topic. All right, so you wrote down the one word, and now you guessed a number. So let me have you vote by raising your hand. If you think the answer is 6% of the American adult population is clinically depressed, put your hand way up high in the air. That's a big goose egg. No, one. One brave soul up front. All right, if you think the answer is 15%, put your hand way up high. So maybe 20 to 25. If you think the answer is 28%, oh my goodness, that's by far the leader. And then 36%. So that may actually be the largest one. So I have good news for you. The answer is 6%. So congratulations to the single winner up here. Calvary will be giving you a new car later today. I didn't say what size. So you're welcome, Calvary. So that's the good news. It's only 6%. Here's the bad news. How big is your church? Because, do the math, in your church, 6% of people walking through your doors every week are clinically depressed. The numbers are triple that for anxiety disorders. The good news is anxiety disorders are much less dangerous than depression. It's problematic, right? It hurts to be anxious, but it's dangerously painful to be depressed. So I was doing this seminar for a church of about 30,000 people. I spoke to their whole staff a few weeks ago, and when I got to the 6%, it got really quiet because in that church of 30,000, they realized they have anywhere from 1,000 to 1,800 people a week coming into that church depressed. So one of the questions you may have is, well, how come I can't tell? People don't look depressed. It's because Christians have a unique kind of depression that we like to use called masked depression. We smile and we fake it well. We pretend to be okay. It's called masked depression. And men do it, women do it, it's cross-culture, but it tends to be more in religious settings, in faith-based settings. We just are not good at saying, I'm in pain. So when Aaron's talking about his story, I wanted to applaud because that's part of what heals us, is being open and honest. So the next question here is, what percentage of American pastors are depressed? We have no idea. Because when we do survey research with pastors, I'm going to say this, and I love you in Christ, but you all lie on the survey research. So we have built into all of our social science, behavioral science surveys indicators that look at consistency of answers. And predictably, pastors and law enforcement officers tend to fake good, is the clinical term. We fudge to the positive. Probably because we're afraid of what people would think. Maybe we're afraid we would lose our job, or we just think that Christians should have a spirit-controlled temperament, to use a really old phrase, right? That a good Christian shouldn't be anxious or depressed. And yet we know that that's not true, that anyone can get depressed at any time, right? So here's some other good news. There are 15% of us in the adult population will spend your entire life free from a season of depression. So in a room this size, there will be a handful of people that would come to a seminar like this, and after we go through all the information, we'll go, I've never gone through that. And here's the other kicker. You never will. 15% of the adult population will never go through a depressive season. So it doesn't mean you won't have a sad day or a sad experience. It just means you won't get stuck in it. For the rest of us schmoes, the other 85% will go through one or more of these depressive seasons in our life. And here's what we know about brain research. Once you've been through one, it's easier to go through a second and a third. We become a little more susceptible because of how our brain, our central nervous system, tends to down-regulate when we're getting depressed. So congratulations if you're in the 15%. The first couple of times I did the seminar, I had people raise their hand if they were in the 15%. That did not go well, so we're not doing that. There were a lot of nasty looks toward the people that had their hands up. But we don't know why. Some people are just not going to fall into it. So if that's you, that's fantastic. But for the rest of us, this is a real issue, right? And it's an important one. I'm going to take you through the 9 symptoms of clinical depression. And you have in front of you a pink handout that has a lot of good basic information. I would encourage you to keep that pink handout, even make copies of it, because we end up counseling a lot of people who are depressed. So it's a really good fact sheet that I've cobbled together from a number of sources. I don't want to get busted for plagiarism. It's not my document. I did some editing on it, but it's a good, just basic resource of information for you. Buried on the second page of that document is the same list. If you would back it up just one backslide. So at the bottom there are 9 symptoms. Thank you. There are 9 symptoms that I'm going to take you through and just explain a little bit. As I do this, I would like you to keep mental track of how many of these symptoms you feel today. Whether it's 1 or 9 or 0, it doesn't matter. But don't write it down. You're not going to share it. Right? This is just something you're going to keep track of as I take you through the 9 symptoms. These then are the clinical symptoms of major depression. The first one is the most obvious one. You feel sad and depressed. You just feel down, right? You just feel down, sad and depressed. Number 2, lethargy. This is not a little bit tired. This is like bone tired. When you can't imagine getting up enough energy to get out of bed or to make it to your car or to do basic tasks, you just don't feel like you have any energy. If you've ever had mono or the flu, it's that kind of tired, right? That just whole body kind of tired. Anhedonia. You see the word hedonism hiding in there. Hedonism is all about pleasure, right? Pleasurable activities, pleasurable experiences, life of pleasure. Anhedonia means diminished capacity for pleasure. Things that used to be really fun for you, you think about them now and you go, right? If it's golf, for me it's fly fishing, whatever it is for you. It could be sex, it could be your favorite hobby, it could be just going for a walk. You can't imagine that mattering or making a difference now. That's anhedonia. Memory and concentration issues. So this one's difficult for those of us that are a little longer in tooth and have a little gray hair. Because if you're over 50, you go, well, I must be depressed, right? I don't know where I am and what I'm doing right now. So it's more than just age-appropriate memory and concentration. This is kind of a general cloudiness that happens when we're depressed. We can't focus. We can't get words or names. Can't remember basic kind of information. It's just like there's just kind of soup in our mind and in our ability to focus. Accident proneness. This is more than just a little bit klutzy. You tend to be klutzy at an early age and continue to be klutzy. This is somebody who's not accident prone, who's suddenly getting into car accidents, dropping things, running into the corners in the house. You're just down. Your body's not working correctly. You're not processing information correctly. And then the most critically important of the whole list is suicidal ideation. Now that seems obvious, but let me tell you a little bit more about that from a clinical standpoint. There are 2 kinds of suicidal ideation, passive and active. So I want you to hear the difference here, because there's a significant difference. Passive suicidal ideation is the kind of things that flow through our mind when we're really stressed or down or just worn out, and we think, it would be okay if the Lord took me home. It would be okay if, right, fill in the blank. That's passive. It's not dangerous. Active suicidal thinking has 3 main components: a plan, access, and motivation. So if you picture a spray can of Pam, I don't know if they even make that product anymore, but it's plan, access, and motivation. When those 3 things begin to crystallize, now we have a very dangerous situation. Now we're beginning to actively think about ending life. Now, if you're in that 15% that's never been depressed, that's an odd thought. What has to happen in the mind of a person to begin thinking about suicide? So I would ask you a question back. How much pain do you have to be in that it would lead you to that kind of thinking? The kind of pain we're talking about is suffocating pain. And I've never said this before, but I'm going to say it to this group for the first time. People who commit suicide don't want to die. They're sick of living. And I need you to try to think about that and understand that so that you can increase your empathy and compassion for people that are struggling. If you've never been through a depressive season, it is exhausting. And it's even physically painful for some people. That unrelenting pain leads you to some dangerous thinking. And that's where people can get. Self-esteem and self-confidence drop. So this is when our confidence drops off the table. So if I told you right now you had to come up here and do a speech with me, right, you'd freak out. You're not prepared, right? There are normal times to be a little freaked out and have self-esteem and self-confidence drops. But this is a consistent just nosedive where you can't work up basic confidence to go to work, to interact. You find yourself hiding and withdrawing from things and situations and people. Sleep disturbances and weight, this is where we were one way and now we're the other. We didn't sleep very much and now we're sleeping all the time. We ate normally and now we're eating all the time. So a small percentage of people who are depressed actually lose weight when they're depressed, which I don't know how you get that one. I never had that one, right? But so we see these wild swings in sleeping and eating. So that's the 9 symptoms, unless I skipped one. There's 9 symptoms there, excuse me. I need you to total them up and see if you have 1 or 2 or 5 or whatever you have. And I want to give you the key. Here's the key. If your total is 0 or 1, that's a green light. You're good to go. If your total is 2, 3, or 4, that's a yellow light. We should be concerned, right? We should pay attention to that. If your total is 5 or higher, and the symptoms have been there 2 weeks or longer, you technically now meet the criteria for what's called major depression or a major depressive disorder. That is the clinical line. It is 5 of 9 for 2 weeks or longer. It's helpful to know that. Now, no matter what your total was, if suicidal ideation was checked off, you automatically skip to a red light. Does that make sense? I mean, if you only have 2, but one of them is suicidal thinking, now we're really in a much more important zone. So the reason I do this is it's good basic education, and it's also an opportunity for you to see how you're really doing today. So I've had people come up after the seminar and tell me either one of 2 things. I thought I was going to be a 5 and I was only a 2, but I've also had people come up with tears in their eyes and say, I thought I was doing fine, but when I was really honest with myself, I'm a 6. And what do I do? So we're going to talk about that. But it's at least helpful to know what clinicians, doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, marriage and family therapists, what we use is this industry standard to understand the issue. Please advance the next slide. So over the years, when I've been helping pastors behind the scenes, I've been keeping notes and just asking questions. And the research question that I've asked in a more specific way the last couple years is this: does being a pastor increase your risk for depression? That really is the essence of the question that we're addressing in this series that we're doing with churches. Does being a pastor increase your risk for depression? And I think the answer is yes, probably. I said before that pastors are not always very honest and transparent in mental health surveys. There's some research out of Canada that's fairly recent that suggests that the actual number for pastors may be as high as 18%, 17.5%. I don't know if it's that high, but I would say this, based on my experience, I believe that the percentage of pastors is at least the same as the general population, if not a little higher. We'll see. We'll see. So this question then is an important one. Does being a pastor put you at risk or greater risk for depression? So I began keeping notes on all the cases I worked with, and I began looking at factors that I could identify in cases that contributed to pastor burnout and pastor depression. And I've labeled these the nasty 9. I'm going to take you through each of the 9. And at the end, I'm going to have you rank. If you think that they are, then I'm going to have you say which one is number 1, number 2, and number 3. You're just going to vote. You'll write in a 1, a 2, or a 3 on that survey, if, in fact, you agree with any of these. They're at least thought-provoking. The first one in the nasty 9 is the feeling that some pastors have that programmatic success is all that matters. That you are your numbers, you are your views, you are your fill in the blank, right? This feeling in the American church that we have to be growing, the scale's always got to be up and to the right, and I'm judged by that performance. So a friend of mine, good friend, that I met in college, very close friend, I asked him one day, I said, why don't you go to conferences? You don't go to Catalyst, you don't go to Exponential, you're not going to go to Spire. Why don't you go? He looked at me with very strong emotion, and he goes, I hate going to those things. That's a pretty strong word. Why do you hate it? He goes, because the first question people ask me is, what are you guys running now? And he goes, we haven't grown in 20 years. Now, this is a friend who's done interventions on me several times. So I did an intervention on my friend that day in Yard House in Pasadena, halfway between where we live. We meet for lunch a couple times a year. And I said, let's talk about that, buddy old pal. And I listed all the things that his church does in the community and globally, and I said, how you can look at that kind of outreach and not consider that success blows my mind, right? And it was a very emotional time because he was able to take it in that day and realize that he had fallen into this trap, that we all have fallen into this trap of size, right, of scope. Do you ever feel that? When I go to president's conferences, I'm starting to move in different circles now that I'm a president, right? I feel it when I walk in the room, and people treat college presidents of large institutions differently than they treat presidents of small institutions. It's kind of stupid, but we still do it. Same with pastors, right? You go to a conference and there's sort of this internal feeling that we have of, well, I'm just fill in the blank, or I'm whatever. That's not the gospel. That is not the Holy Spirit. That is America consumerism and crass commercialism gone awry in our thinking. That's not the gospel. But it's this feeling that leaves this residue of embarrassment and shame and guilt, right? Programmatic success is all that matters. Loneliness and boredom. When I was a young pastor right out of college, I worked for a couple different churches. It was shocking to me, they were both small churches, it was shocking to me how boring it could be some days. And I automatically knew I couldn't tell anyone, right? So who do you tell if you're lonely or bored? Do you tell the elders? Hey, I don't have enough to do. How's that going to go, right? I don't have anything to do 2 afternoons a week. And it can get really lonely in any size church. What do we do with that? It's a risky thing, I think, to know who to talk to about that feeling, right? So it can be lonely and it can be boring. It can actually be very lonely. Sibling rivalry on staff. What we have found in our research is the larger the church, the more prominent this one has become in general. The larger the church, the more problematic this one has become. Because this is all about in-groups and out-groups. I'm going to say something, and if you think about it, I think you may agree with me, especially if you think about junior high. The meanest thing you can do to someone is exclude them. The meanest thing you can do to someone is exclude them. We actually have a lot of social psychology research that says that that's true. That if I want to hurt Aaron, then I invite everybody at this table to lunch except him. And that will wound him. And yet in large churches, we don't realize that there are a lot of people that feel like they're odd man or odd woman out. That can't get close to fill in the blank. The senior, the executive, whomever. The most injured pastor I've tried to help the last few years, this is pretty horrible, had been in the in-group for most of his career. A new senior pastor came in, and he got kicked to the out-group. And he never found out why. He just knew he used to have a seat at the table, and now he's relegated to these odd places that they put him in the organizational structure. When we don't feel connected, when we don't feel in, we get really desperate, all of us. Right? So this sibling rivalry happens when somebody new and bright and shiny comes along with better skinny jeans, with the perfect rips, and they're getting more face time or they're getting more stage time, but we know we're not supposed to admit that, pastors, right? We're supposed to be humble and yay, God, everybody happy, snappy, peppy, zesty. We should be happy for anybody's success, and yet we don't like it when somebody gets more face time or stage time. And what do we do with that cognitive dissonance? I'm not supposed to be jealous, but I am. And what do I do about it? Lack of true soul care. So this one is always the awkward part of the seminar for me because this is one that I really struggle with, just taking care of ourselves. So even though I worked at Hope for 25 years, the Board of Trustees put me through a pretty rigorous series of interviews, which, is fine. It's not like they had time to get to know me over 25 years, so it's fine. I'm not bitter at all. Oh, we're streaming this. No, I'm truly not bitter at all. Loved it all. Loved every meeting. Right? So the abiding concern they had was not my intellect, not my commitment to the university, not my credentials. Their abiding concern for me was, could I take care of myself? They said, how are you going to make sure you don't burn out? And I didn't have great answers. I had some good enough answers. I didn't have great answers, because here's what I've done my entire career. See if you identify with this. I have been running most of my career with about a quarter tank of gas. And what I have done is I've consistently run that tank of energy down to zero, taken off just enough hours or days to get the tank back up to a quarter, and then run it right back out, over and over again. The problem with this really nifty approach is that we burn through a ton of adrenaline. It makes us more prone to disease, to illness. We run our life on adrenaline, and it burns our bodies and our brains out. So the challenge for all of us is this: how do you create margin to do ministry well for the long haul? How do you do in your mind what you need to do to create space and margin so that you can refuel, so that you can do this not for 5 more years, but for 25 more years? Not for 3 more years, but for 30 more years. It was a very difficult process for me with the trustees at Hope because I had to confess to them that I have not done very well with this in my career. I just haven't. I love to fly fish, so I told them, I said, well, one of the things I know works for me is to be on the water for a day or two every few months, because what I find is that if I can fly fish for a day, that puts a lot of gas back in the tank. So they said to me, this was a pretty cool moment, actually. I go, then you need to fly fish a lot. I said, well, can we get that in writing? I'd really like to cash that in a few times. So it's an important question. Why don't we, all of us, take better care of ourselves? I think that there is a sickness in us as achievers that we have to appear engaged, on task, busy, committed all the time. And we worry about what people would think about us or say about us if we took all of our vacation time, if we took some downtime. So I will give you, this is spoiler alert. So 3 of the issues have risen to the top in this survey, this 1,200, 1,300 people that we've talked to so far. By far, the number 1 issue on the list is this item. So your peers in ministry, California, Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona, have said that's number 1 on their list, is they're just not able to create time and space to take better care of themselves. Me too. So think about it. Unresolved trauma and grief. Now, this is a hard one to talk about because trauma is different for each and every one of us, right? What's traumatic for you may not be traumatic for me, vice versa. What causes you grief may not cause me grief. But I will simply say that pastors as a group are really good at providing care in times of grief and trauma, but we're not so good. I'm an ordained pastor too. We're not so good at getting the space that we need for our own grief and resolving our own trauma. So let me ask you a question. Have you had someone that you were close to in your life or at your church pass away in the last few years? And if you did, how much time did you give yourself to grieve? My experience with pastors is that you don't even give yourself a day sometimes to grieve, because you go into helping mode. I do too. When I'm confronted with bad news, I automatically and instantaneously go into helping, pastoring, counseling, fixing. Not necessarily in that order, right? I want to fix it. But we have our own process. When that sweet little old lady in your church dies, that should hurt your heart, and you should take time to feel it. When your grandparent passes away, you need time off. Why are we so good at extending grace to others but not allowing it for ourselves? When my mentor passed away about 20 years ago, Doug Dickey, who was a beloved father and grandfather figure on our campus out in California, when he passed away, a number of us that were close to him were just rocked. But we didn't all handle it very well. 2 weeks after he passed, I had a colleague, a Christian psychologist, pull me aside, and she said to me, she goes, "You haven't done any grief work around Doug's passing, have you?" I said, "Yes, I have." She goes, "What have you done?" It was a little contentious. I said, "Well, I cried." She goes, "Yeah, how long?" It's like, you don't know me well enough to ask me how long I cried when Doug died. I said, "I cried." And she goes, "You haven't done any grief work." And she goes, "If you don't do it, you will pay the price for this." She goes, "I challenge you." This is no lie. So we're in a counseling office, like off to the side, and she's like doing this little intervention on me. She goes, "I dare you to take 1 day off and just go think about Doug all day." So out of spite, I took a day off. And I went to my mother-in-law's house in Huntington Beach, and I forced myself to turn everything off in the house and just sit and think about my friend Doug. And when I did, I lost it. Even thinking about it now, it still hurts that I lost a really important person. But how easy was it to just gloss over it and just move on? When we do that, when we don't grieve appropriately, we pay the price. And one of the prices we often pay is depression 6 months later, 12 months later, 18 months later. So what do you have to do to give yourself space when you experience trauma and grief. On the trauma side, my experience with pastors has been that there's not always a lot of big T traumas in ministry, but I do think that there are a lot of little t traumas in ministry. A lot of losses, a lot of issues around reputation or performance, or somebody says something, or elders that don't treat you like the way you wanted to be treated, or a staff lead doesn't treat you the way that you want to be treated, and we have these feelings, and they get churned up, but we don't process them. We don't want to talk about them, so we sweep them under the carpet, and we find out 6, 12, 18 months later we're anxious or depressed, and we can't connect the dots. So it's worth thinking about as well. Unclear job expectations. I was sure this was going to be high up on the list. Turns out this is dead last in the survey, but I'm going to sell it anyway. I keep selling it. This is just a question. Do you have a current job description, and is it realistic? Turns out most of our churches are doing a really good job with job descriptions. But if you don't have a job description, it can be anxiety-producing and depressing to go to work and not know what you're supposed to be doing or what success looks like in the mind of your employer. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that because I know where it's going to come in the survey. Addictions. Now, there are a lot of things that I could list here that pertain to depression, but I'm only going to talk about the most important one as it pertains to depression, and that is alcohol. So when I was a little boy, as a pastor's kid, no pastors that I knew drank. They certainly didn't drink in public. If they drank at home. So, a couple of generations go by, and now many, if not most pastors, have changed their thinking about drinking, and now some of you all feel very comfortable drinking, and it's not an issue, unless you're depressed. And we forget the most basic fact about alcohol that we all learned in 10th grade science, which is alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. So think about how ludicrous this is if we're depressed and we're treating depression with a depressant. Why in the world would we do that? We're smart people. We do it because it works today. Alcohol is great for the weather. Problem is it kills the climate. Alcohol is great for the weather. It'll make you feel less or more of whatever's happening. The problem with it is it down-regulates your central nervous system's ability to balance itself emotionally. If you've never heard that before, I want to say it again because it's important that you understand this for you and the people that you care for. Alcohol actually turns down the central nervous system's ability to regulate itself. It pushes down our ability to have a balanced mood. It does it slowly, systematically, and very efficiently. It is a slow burn depressant. So just ask the question, if you're struggling with depression and you're drinking, can you cut back or can you stop? Right? Because it's sort of like taking anti-Prozac. Even though it makes you feel better today, it's hurting you in the long haul. So that's parental. I'm done. All right. Shame over brokenness. We've all done things in the past that we're not proud of. All of us. I did a lot of stuff in junior high that no one should ever know, including stealing a lot from Thrifties. I stole a lot of candy from Thrifties. Not proud. I went to give them back $20 years later, and they were closed. So instead, to make up for it, I bought full-price popcorn and candy at the theater next time that I went to a movie, and I thought somehow that must have righted the scales somehow. We have done things in our lives that we are ashamed of. Maybe last night, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 25 years ago. My experience with pastors and Christian professionals is that we carry the shame differently. There is more embarrassment for us, that we should somehow be above it and not ever have taken part in fill in the blank. So is that an issue for you? And how does it manifest itself? And then finally, and last on purpose, is this idea that ministry can be depressing because of critical people in our church. I don't know about you, but I think most of us are pretty sensitive when it comes to criticism. And it's hard because we put our heart and soul, you put your heart and soul into ministry. This is hard work that you're doing, and then people come along and just open their door into our side. Right? And we've got these door dings all up and down from people that I think they're trying to be helpful, maybe not. So years ago when I worked at a church, this will tell you how long ago it was. I was the Christian education pastor. So That's been gone for a long time. Now it would be like the pastor of Connection Church, Bridge, Abundant, Rooted Connection impressions. I don't know what it would be called. So I was in charge of birth to death. The only groups I didn't get to work with were the ones I really liked, which were the junior high and high school kids. I worked with everybody else. So I worked at this little church. We went into a building program, and we had to set up this temporary classrooms in a school next door because of the building program. So I had to set up all the kids' rooms and the nursery and everything. So one Sunday after church, I see from across the parking lot, the second church was over, I see a lady across the parking lot from our church. We'll call her Rita, because her name's Rita. And she's standing across the parking lot with one sheet of paper totally thrashed at the bottom and open at the top, and she's shaking, and she yells, "Paul, I've got a complaint!" And she starts hoofing it directly at me, right? It's like 300 feet across the parking lot. As she's walking, I'm thinking, I do not want to have this conversation. I wanted to go to my office or the car, hide, climb a tree, anything to not have to talk to this lady, because I'd already been dinged by her a couple of times in my few months there. Rita gets up in my face that day, and she's shaking. She's so mad. And she takes her little hand, and she does this in my face, and she goes, "Paul, there were live ants on my baby in the nursery. What are you going to do about it?" I mean, she was so mad. She was trembling, right? So I quietly said to her, "Rita, I'm sorry. I don't know what to tell you. I went in before church. Everything was fine. All the toys had been cleaned, disinfected. I didn't see any ants." She goes, "Well, you should have seen them." So we go back and forth for a little while, and now I'm shaking because I'm mad, but I can't show it, right? You know what I'm talking about. My adrenaline's pumping. I'm trying to be calm. She's livid. I don't know how it ended, but I know this. We had been given tickets that day for a Rams game by somebody in the church. So my wife Leslie and I went to a Rams game, only she was there, and I was only there in my body. I spent the entire date that day mad, shaking my head, and resenting Rita. I was wearing a bright green hat, and I remember pulling it way down over my head and shaking my head for hours. I didn't watch the game. It was not a good date, because all I wanted was to go back in time and either run away or let her have it. So I'm doing this seminar at a church of about 8,000, and the table right up in front, I'm finishing the Rita story, and one guy leans over to the other and goes, he goes, "We got a whole van full of Ritas." You have any Ritas in your church? And what do they do to our soul? One of the things I did not love about being in ministry is I felt like everybody at my church thought they were my boss. Now, whether that was true or not, that's how I felt. I felt like people felt entitled to say whatever just because it's church. Higher education is much more boundary-filled than ministry. Ministry is just very wide open, right? So how do we handle criticism, and what does it do to us? Years ago, I had a class of 32 students. I had 30 write really positive responses at the end of the semester. One wrote a mixed review, and one student torched me. And years later, I can tell you verbatim sections of the comments from the one that torched me. So how do we do with criticism? What does it do to our soul? How do we clean up after this has happened to us? Years ago, some researchers in Northern California started looking at families, and they found out that stressed families tend to produce 3 kinds of kids. They came up with these labels that you see at the bottom of your sheet called the hero, the rebel, and the lost. I'm going to get to those in just a second. That's my commercial. If you would right now, though, pull out the survey, and if you think that any of the 9, oh, you know what? You can't do that because I haven't explained the last one yet. Just kidding. Don't vote yet. I don't want to take number 9 out of the running. Sorry, did that order out of order. Let me tell you about this last one first, then you vote. So years ago, these researchers started looking at families. They found out that stressed out families produce 3 kinds of kids, 6 to 8, but 3 predominantly. A hero child, a rebel child, and a lost child. Then we extended the research into non-stressed families and found that non-stressed families produce 3 kinds of kids: hero children, lost children, and rebel children. The exact same dynamic happened in both kinds of families. So let me tell you about these 3 kinds. The hero child, which many of us in the room are going to recognize this and identify with this. The hero child is often the firstborn. These are the kids that in our families are really good. They're really conscientious. They're achievers. They love to follow rules. They're good at things. They get along well with people older than them. They're often considered more mature or more spiritual than other people their age. They have a lot of trophies that they've actually earned, not just participation trophies, but actual, I earned this trophy. Right? They get A's, they get A pluses. When they graduate from high school, they have over a 4.0, however that works. Right? The hero children are on it. You love it when they step up to lead because they'll lead a whole thing. As little 6-year-olds, they'll take over the class, march everybody around, right? From a young age, we see hero children as having it all together and being good at being good. So turns out that hero children, same thing happens in adulthood. They join organizations, they rise farther and faster, they make more money, they go higher up the corporate ladder, and we die younger because we're high stress. I heard that. Because we're high stress, right? And the engine is always on, going full bore. Those are us who are hero children. The next one, the rebel child. A few of you will identify with this. If you don't want to raise your hand, though, you rebels. They usually come along right after the hero in the family birth order, and as good and faithful as the hero is, the rebel is just as big a knucklehead. So the heroes like to blow stuff up. Rules, structure, they just enjoy pushing people's buttons. They're smart. They don't get good grades, though. Here's something that may surprise you. They're usually really sensitive emotionally. I mean, they can be kind of teddy bears inside. Underneath the tattoos and the prison record and everything. So I didn't even know this was an option. I'm a hero child. My sister is much older. She's a hero child. I didn't even know you could be a rebel child until 6th grade. This is no lie. I didn't even know it was an option. Like, you could do this? 6th grade, Mr. Rokangas, my teacher, that's really his name, Mr. Rokangas says, I'll never forget the day. He says, everybody take out a clean sheet of paper for our test. Everybody got out a clean sheet of paper except for Joe Cook. Joe Cook did not get out a clean sheet of paper and started to get a little weird. And then Mr. Rokangas said, Joe, take out a clean sheet of paper. And at this point, I noticed both Joe's face and Mr. Rokangas' face were turning bright red. And the weirdest thing happened I had ever seen. Joe still didn't get out a clean sheet of paper. And then the test started. And Joe didn't take the test. And I waited for the world to fall off its axis. So we're all taking the test. I'm like, Joe Cook should be arrested. Something bad should happen to Joe Cook. Joe Cook's not taking the test, right? So I'm flipping out as a hero child. A week later, we all came into class, and turned out Joe Cook got to get transferred to Mr. Gersten's class. So he finished the year with a different teacher. I didn't know until that day that you could not do everything you were told. But rebels, y'all just love it. You just blow stuff up. It's fun, right? Here's a little interesting tidbit. A lot of rebels have learning disabilities that go undiagnosed for a long time. And part of the confusion that they create is kind of a smokescreen for the fact that they're having some difficulty learning. Not all the time, but it's higher than normal for that group. And then there's the saddest one to me, which is the lost child. The lost child is the one in the middle. They're not great at everything. They're not getting arrested, right? They're not blowing stuff up. They're just quiet. They're shy. Maybe they don't have any friends. Maybe they have one friend-ish kind of person in their life. The saddest thing about the lost child is that they have not yet found their voice. They have not yet found their voice. So the challenge for these three are pretty obvious. The hero needs to sometimes not be in charge, and sometimes need to know what it's like to blow it and get grace. The rebel needs to show their true self and just be good. There's goodness in there. And choose to put their best self forward. The lost child needs to find their voice and say, I need and I want. So guess which one of the three most pastors identify with by far the hero child. We are, many of us, pleasers. And we have, since we were really little, been taking care of people in really profoundly sophisticated ways. We walk into a room and we can read it immediately. We know who's doing well, who's not, who's struggling, who's doing great. We get uneasy when there is uneasiness around us. It becomes part of us. We're responsible, we're conscientious to a fault. So I wrote this statement about hero children, and I'm reading it the exact same way in each seminar because I spent a long time crafting this, and I like it, and I don't want to vary. So I'm just going to read a statement to you. When this is over today, if you want to come up and shoot a picture of this, I would encourage you to do it because you can just get it that way. Don't take notes on this one. Just listen. See if it resonates. The church as unpleasable parent. At the very root, deep down of our pain as pastors and therapists and helpers, is his insatiable desire to be liked, loved, useful, and known as caring, careful, and gifted. And we are gifted and thoughtful and caring and nurturing and talented, but the very act of being these things backfires. And it backfires in two very painful ways. First, it backfires because as good as we are at these things, we can never do them perfectly. We can never preach, teach, counsel, or lead with perfection. But we know, or at least part of us knows, that it's futile. It also backfires because no matter how much praise, adoration, adulation we receive, we always secretly wish it were more. Where does it come from? Well, we know where it comes from. Early in our life, our idea of ourself was tied to being good and faithful and sensitive and reliable. And we were known as being gifted. We were known as pleasers. But in our pursuit to please, we got lost. And lost people panic, always. Prolonged panic leads to depression. So the horrific trap we face early on is this: if I'm good at being good, if I'm even getting fame and lots of positive strokes for it, I wonder what would happen to me, to myself, if I stopped being good. I'd die. Or worse, I'd disappoint someone. Now take this blueprint and put it high above your head and look to God. It becomes impossible to experience God the way that He wants to be experienced because we're used to this token economy. If I'm good, good things happen. If I'm bad, bad things happen. And that is not God's economy. In God's economy, I'm loved just because I'm a child. Plain and simple. I'm loved just because I'm a child. So in my mind, as we consider these 9, this can be one of the more toxic issues. If the drumbeat of your heart is to please people, ministry can be really depressing because there's always going to be a Rita or 2 or 3 who will come along and just steal our joy if we let them. Now, I'd like you to vote. Think back for just a minute on all 9. And if you would do me a favor, if you find them relevant, if you would rank the top 3 in your experience is yours. It doesn't have to look like anybody else's, but if you'll just put a 1 or a 2 or a 3 in the top 3 that you think are depressive or potentially depressive for pastors, that would help. And then after you vote on your top 3, if you identify with any of those 3 child positions, the very bottom of the page, if you would put a mark by one that you identify with, if you identify with any of those 3. It's okay if it's blank. So 1, a 2, a 3, and then if you identify with any of those 3 roles, please make a mark on that. Guys, go ahead and advance the slide for me. So I told you at the beginning I would share my story, and I want to do that for just a few minutes. And the reason I do this is not because it is comfortable for me, because in truth it is really uncomfortable for me. The reason I share this is to free up 1 or 2 or 3 of you who have been afraid to share your own story, in hopes that it might free you up to be more honest and more transparent. So you can tell by my comments that I was a prototypical hero child growing up. I actually liked being a pastor's kid. My Friends that were PKs did not enjoy it. How many other PK? My band of brothers and I were such knuckleheads that we had one Sunday school teacher that would always promote with us, right, to watch us. Mrs. Martin came with us every year. But I loved church, right? People took good care of me and my sister. But I was an achiever. I liked good grades. I liked being helpful. I liked to run stuff. I was a leader in my youth group. And when I got to college, I really blossomed. I went to small schools. I went to Milligan College in Tennessee for a year, and then I transferred to PCC, now Hope, and in a lot of ways have never left. I loved college, partly because I was in control of what I did and whether or not I would move, because we moved a lot growing up, and I did not like that. I was in control now, right? So my senior year, here's my trophy case my senior year of college. I was a resident assistant, which I loved. I was a peer leader in the dorms. I was a paid youth pastor at my home church, which I thought was really cool, and I told anybody who would listen. I was preaching in a few churches, which I thought was really good for me and the Lord. And I was engaged to be married to a really sweet young woman. And a month after graduation, I was none of those things. I broke off my engagement. I left my home church. I was waiting for a job to start, and I lived by myself in a stinky little apartment in Fullerton, about a mile from campus. And I went into a very dark, nasty depression that lasted almost 10 months. I had never been depressed before. I'd had bad days, but I had never, ever been depressed. I didn't even know what was happening. All I knew is that I felt horrible, and I didn't want to be around anyone. So I didn't. I holed up in my apartment on the second floor, and I didn't have enough money to run the little air conditioner, so I would sit in that little stinky apartment in sweat and watch black and white TV day and night. The little money I had, I bought food that wasn't good for me, and I just holed up, and I got more depressed. After about a month of that, there was a knock on my door one day. I opened the door, and there was Carl, my childhood friend, who had come down to the college and lived in the dorms and gone to a community college, but we'd known each other since we were 2. Grew up in the church together, and I'll never forget what he said to me. I opened the door, and he said, "Where have you been?" Because I keep calling you and leaving you messages, but you don't return them. It was really easy to disappear back then from people, right? So I invited him in, and he sat down on one end of my little sectional couch, and I sat down on the other end, and I told him my sad, horrible story. That was 85% legitimate clinical depression and probably 15% self-pity, just being honest. There was a healthy dose of self-pity in there. So I told him how my life was ruined and how I broke off this engagement, and I didn't know if I'd done the right thing, and nobody cared, and life was horrible, and I didn't have any friends, and I was depressed, right? Not for all these reasons. And Carl did something that changed the trajectory of my adult life. And I get emotional every time I tell this story, but I think you'll see why. When I finished my story, Carl got up and he walked over to my end of the sectional and he grabbed my wrist and tried to pull me up. I did not want to do that, so I let my body go limp, so he pulled me onto the ground. With a thud, I land on the second floor apartment floor. And Carl stood over me and looked down at me, and I looked at him with resentment because I wasn't enjoying this. And he looked down at me and he said, "We're going out." And I said, "You're going out? I'm not going anywhere." And here he did one of the most loving things anyone has ever done for me. He just stood and stared at me. And we had a little staring contest. In the summer of 1984 in Fullerton, in a gross little apartment, my buddy stood over me and stared at me until I blinked first. And just to make this stop, I said, "Fine, we'll go out." And he said, this was just as loving, he goes, "You need a shower." So I went and took a shower, and my friend Carl took me to the beach and bought me dinner, good food, and we sat and talked and laughed about childhood memories for hours and hours and hours. And the next day, I woke up, and my depression was this much better. but it was the turning point in that 10-month journey. Now, I had to go on and manage it with a good therapist, a really good therapist. I had to manage it medically, spiritually, emotionally, relationally. I had to climb out, which required some action on my part. But that afternoon and evening with Carl was what turned it for me. That he loved me enough to literally pull me out of the cave I was hiding in. Now, in your lifetime, you're probably going to be on both ends of that equation. You're either going to be a Paul or you're going to be a Carl, and you'll probably be both. Here's what I know about depressed people. We desperately need Carls in our lives who love us enough to force us to take steps. And as pastors, we need to blink and let people help us. It's embarrassing. It's uncomfortable. We're not used to being on the receiving end of love and care, but I'm here to tell you it can save your life. It can turn things around for you to be more open to being ministered to. So we all have choices. That day was one of the best choices I ever made, was to not kick him out, but to go to dinner with Carl. So I want to encourage you to take some steps. 3 important steps. First one, be honest with yourself and another. If your total earlier was 5 or 7 or hopefully not 9, what does that tell you? You probably need to take some steps toward health, toward healing, towards wholeness. I do know this, whatever steps you're taking, steps in relationship are among the most healing. To choose to talk to someone, right? To do life together, to trust someone with your story, whether it's anxiety or depression or trauma, whatever it is. Make a choice to take a step. Next one, decide to get fit. This is a mental decision as much as it is anything else. And in depression and anxiety and emotional health issues, we don't take giant steps in the beginning. We take little tiny micro steps, little bitty steps. I'm going to eat a little better today. I'm going to drink less. I'm going to spend time with someone when what I really want to do is go home and crash, sit in front of the TV and watch SportsCenter 3 hours in a row, even though it's the same broadcast 3 times. What are the little steps that I need to take to be more fit? So I'm going to confess something. This is super embarrassing. Y'all, I signed up for fat camp. My doctor has a thing called Healthy Balance class on Monday nights. I hate it. But I got tired of the annual discussion with my doctor called, do you want to die young or not? It's a fun talk with my doctor every year. He looks at me and he says, you're going to die young unless you start taking better care of yourself. Super encouraging. Thanks. Thanks, Dr. Lee. So this last one, I was waiting for it. Here we go. So with the trustees in one ear and my wife in the other, I went to my physical this time in August and I said, all right, I'm ready. Sign me up for that stupid class. You can tell I have a good attitude. So I've been going on Monday nights. And I appreciate this trip this week because I got to get out of class this week. It's amazing how just a little bit of education, a little bit of accountability help though, right? We know we need to take some steps. What do those steps look like for you? A little bit breeds success, and then success starts breeding more success with health and mental health, right? Allow this to be a process. For me, it took 10 months and the rest of my adult life. See, I'm not in the 15%, I'm in the 85%, and once we've been through one depressive season, it is easier to get through and into others. So some of you will identify with this statement, the words I'm going to choose, I choose very carefully. I have learned to manage the melancholy part of my personality. I have learned to manage the melancholy part of my personality. Literature, sometimes it's called the black dog of depression. So when the black dog starts sneaking up on me, I've learned how to keep it in the back of the SUV instead of the front seat with me. I manage it. I take better care of myself when I can feel the fog beginning to come in, because I have to, because I don't want to go back to that place. It takes time to learn how to do that, to recognize the signs and symptoms of anxiety or depression and take better care of ourselves, including time off. Make decisions. Take steps. I want to recommend 2 books to you. If you don't have these in your library, you need both of them. They're cheap. They're like $8-10 each on Amazon. One is Healing for Damaged Emotions by David Seamans. It's like in its 8th or 9th printing now. It's a good, just basic Christian mental health book. Really good. Healing for Damaged Emotions by Seamans. And the second one is less well known, but it is a really good book called The Grief Recovery Handbook by James and Friedman. It really takes us through the process of how we get out of grief in healthy ways, not in avoidant ways, not in maladaptive ways, but in really productive ways. So Healing for Damaged Emotions and the Grief Recovery Handbook. So the last thing that I want to do for you is pray a prayer of blessing on your life. And then I'm going to take you through for a few minutes a guided prayer time that, if you let it, can be a really nice moment. If you're uncomfortable when I switch from the blessing prayer to the guided prayer time, if that makes you uncomfortable, then just think about something else. Open your eyes, just be quiet as I take us through a guided prayer time. Would you do that with me? If you could turn down the stage lights and the house lights a little bit. Thank you. All right, let's pray. God, I thank you for this time, these people. Lord, the work that they do, I thank you for that. I'm grateful for the work that they do. But Lord, more importantly, I'm grateful for them personally, for their lives and for their hearts. And Lord, I just ask for a special blessing on them and their hearts, their lives, and the people that they love, that you would protect them, that you would build them up, that you would strengthen them. Lord, if they're feeling down, I ask that you would lift them up. If they're feeling anxious, I pray that you would calm them down. Lord, be God of their hearts. Lord, allow them to take steps that they might need to take, that we need to take. Help us to take the steps we know we need to. Father, help the men and women here to realize they're not alone. They're not in a job on an isolated island, but rather help us to all know that we are connected because of our love of you and the fact that we are all in this together, that this really is family. So bless them, keep them. Now I'd like to take you through a guided prayer exercise. And what I want you to do is, using your mind's eye, with your eyes closed, I want you to imagine that you are the only person left in this room. Everybody else has left. It's just you. And Jesus walks into the room and walks directly over to your table and sits next to you right now. And using the imagination God gave you, I want you to imagine that Jesus is reaching out his hand and lightly touching you on the shoulder or the back. And he looks at you in the way only our Savior could, and he says, my child, tell me what's hurting. And you begin to silently just tell the Lord what hurts, what ache, what hurt, what sadness, what struggle. Whatever's holding you down or holding you back, just share it with our Lord right now, quietly, silently. Picture his touch. Feel it. And as he's sitting with you and comforting you, you can feel some of the hurt and stress and sadness begin to lift and ease and dissolve. And the Holy Spirit is moving some of that pain out of your heart. The loneliness, the sadness. And some of us need to forgive ourselves right now. And some of us need to forgive others. And Jesus looks at you and simply says to you the words that we love to hear. He just says, I love you. I love you. Father, I thank you that this is not just our imagination. This is who you said you would be for us. That you said you would be a comforter when we needed a comforter, and Lord, we need a comforter. We need to know that we're okay. Lord, we need to feel the feelings of connection. Lord, I thank you for Emmanuel. Thank you that you're not a God far away, but you're a God in us. Thank you that that mystery has been revealed to us, that you literally invade our hearts and minds, even now. Father, we need you. We love you. We thank you. In the precious name of Jesus. Amen. So, I want to thank you. My prayer this morning was that the Holy Spirit would do a work in your heart today, and that you would feel encouraged and lifted, that your load would feel a little lighter as a result of being here. It is an honor to do this. The reason I didn't do this for a long, long time is because I was too embarrassed. So I've had this seminar inside of me for 30 plus years, but I was just too embarrassed. And when these pastors took their own lives, I thought, enough with embarrassment. Let's be real with each other. Life is hard. And ministry is challenging. We've got to go through this together. No more. I don't want to see any more of these headlines. Let's love each other. Let's stop being competitive. Let's just love each other. Amen? I don't know how we shift gears after that, but we're going to. Thank you. If you would fold over the surveys for us, we're going to take those and add them to our database. So I said before, we're going to transition into questions in a second. I said before that the number one answer we're getting across the West and now the Midwest is soul care, is by far at the top of the list. Would you all be open if we came back in a year and did a seminar just on soul care for pastors? Would you be open to that? Because in my mind, that's kind of where we might be headed, is to take the top 2 or 3 and have something for that. So maybe let's think about that. Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to do questions. Please don't ask about the Carl story, because I can't get through that again.
You spent quite a bit of time talking about the hero child and the rebel child.
Yep.
I was wondering, how do we come alongside the lost children to help them find their voices?
That is a fantastic question. It takes quality, one-on-one time for the lost child or the lost adult to be able to trust you. It's a lot of quality, quiet time together. The first thing that has to happen is we have to tune our eyes to find them, because we're automatically drawn to the heroes and the rebels. It takes longer to learn how to focus on the lost. My wife is intuitively good at seeing lost kids. I'm intuitively good at seeing hero children, right? And I get the neurotic life that is a hero child. Even though my wife is a hero child, she's just wired, and what she does is she looks for quiet. So she's a 6th grade teacher. She really hones in on those kids that don't talk and spends time with them, right? So there are a few of us that are just super quiet. They tend to be shy. It means that we pull up alongside them in the beginning and just spend time with them, and then ask very personal questions once there's a comfort level. And that's hard for lost kids and lost adults. But tell me about your life. Tell me about your story. What do you love about school or not love? Tell me about your job. Just begin to get them talking about themselves, because deep down, we're all a little bit narcissistic. We like to talk about ourselves. So we have to kind of draw that lost child or adult out, and then not judge. If you judge that person, it's all over. So we just quietly, persistently spend time with them. Does that help? Okay. That's a good question. Thank you. Anyone else?
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned how people in ministry experience mask depression. And so one of my questions was, how does the masks impact the symptoms of depression?
So the longer we deny depression, the longer it has an opportunity to take hold, and the longer it's in us, the harder it is to get out of us. So if our commitment is to image, we are postponing our treatment and our healing, right? So if what we really care about is the persona, we're just delaying recovery. And from a brain behavior standpoint, every month that we're not dealing makes the treatment take many, many more months down the road. So we're just delaying that ability. But it's understandable. I mean, we all do it. We all pretend. We have a tendency to pretend, because professionally, all right, you guys have the only profession that has to be morally on point all the time, right? You're on stage. People are watching and judging. So in order to drop the mask, you have to first choose safe people to do it with. I don't recommend doing this to your whole church, but to your small group, to your spouse, to your best friend, to your doctor, absolutely. But it's just, where do I want to spend my energy? And a lot of us are spending energy on the mask, and don't realize it. Does that help? Is that kind of what you meant or not? So no, that's a big no. That's not at all what you meant. So let's try again. It's a good answer to some other question. Okay.
So to clarify, I guess,
yes, help me.
How can we identify the symptoms in others more so because of the masks? How does wearing that mask impact the symptoms that in other people, and how can we identify those through the masks better?
So in my mask or in the other? So my friend Joe, are you saying he's wearing the mask?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
so I'm worried about my
identifying
friend.
it in
Got
other
it.
people.
I totally misunderstood.
Yep.
Thank you for clarifying. That's just like teaching again. When you finish answering, the student goes, well, that's not at all what I asked. So it requires conversations, because we're not likely to be very transparent about this, whether it's somebody I've known for 30 years or somebody I've known for 3 months, right? So part of that means I'm pretty transparent as I get to know people now. I didn't used to be. And it just means I'm more committed to being transparent. As I have learned to be more transparent, the people that I do life with feel more comfortable to be transparent. When you do a full frontal assault and just say, hey, I think you might be depressed, that never goes well. And I go, no, I'm not, you're depressed. All right, well, that was not helpful. A little education can be good, right? And just invite conversation around it. But the bigger the group, the more threatening it is. So like if you try to do this in a connection group of 20 people, and let's have spiritual health month, That's not going to go well. That's been my experience anyway, that's too much pressure and people flip out. If I have a good friend, I'm going to ask lovingly how he or she is really doing. But I find that just being more transparent than I used to be goes a long way. I did better that time, huh? Oh, good. As a hero child, it's important that we get that. I got an F and an A, so that's good. All right.
How would you, how can churches as a whole, maybe more specifically the leadership, come along their pastors, kind of moving forward? What do you see as a healthy model for churches and leadership to serve their pastors to help them, navigate this?
Yeah. So I think there's two things. No one has asked that yet. That succinctly. I think there's two things to do. One is pastors on stage need to open the door a little bit. Whether that's being a little bit transparent about him or herself, or just transparent about the fact that as a church, right? So if this is my church and there's 150 people in the room this week, I want to say something as the pastor, like, I know in a room this size, we probably have some of our folks that are struggling with X, Y, and Z. Know that that's okay here. Know that we care about you. So one is be a little more open and intentional on stage. The second is to have resources in place behind the scenes so that when somebody comes up to me and goes, yeah, that's me, I'm very anxious or I'm very depressed, we have some place to go. So we have a short list of Christian counselor referrals, or we have a connection group, or we have a recovery ministry, or hopefully all three of those, right? And we have a place that we can take people. If there is a wall on stage and leaders pretend that everything is perfect, the congregation's going to have a hard time being healthy. If, on the other hand, you've got a millennial pastor that shares everything all the time, that's not helpful either, especially generationally for people that are older, because we begin to lose trust in a leader that's too vulnerable when we get to my age and older. So somewhere in there's a sweet spot where we open the door a little bit. If pastors would be willing to talk about their own struggles remote, not recent, again, because generationally you can't talk very much about recent struggles with older parishioners. They don't love it. That helps too, right? So I think both. Be a little more transparent on stage and have resources in place behind the scenes. General support for grief and loss, divorce recovery, substance abuse recovery, and then just like a general support group for, garden variety everything. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Aaron, are we okay on time? Okay. Yes, sir.
Paul, just a quick question. You've done an excellent job talking about depression and really bringing out the effect of it in physical suicide. Would you talk for a moment maybe about career suicide and maybe specifically sexual addiction that seems to be running rampant?
So addictions, I only talked about alcohol, right? So there are lots of other things that can derail us. The reason that sexual addiction is so potent is because it is such a compelling and instantaneous high. It is a powerful emotional and physical high that's easily accessible now, and it's a proxy for intimacy, right? So if you've never heard that term before, that's a helpful term for your thinking around pornography addiction, sexual acting out. It's a proxy for intimacy, right? So if you think about it, at the moment of orgasm, there is a total collapse of the self that happens when two people are married, they love each other, they're having sexual intercourse, they literally collapse into each other. The word for orgasm in the French is a miniature death. There's that moment of total union. As soon as we begin to pull away from each other, we're confined by the sanctity and the protection of a marriage covenant, and we're contained, and we learn how to be intimate. Well, if you take sex out of that frame, the God-given frame, and just focus on physical arousal, it's like a rat that's put in a cage that can keep pushing the pleasure bar and keep getting a treat every time they do it. Eventually, they just get sick, but they won't stop pressing the bar. That's kind of how sexual addiction works. It fires off all the dopamine pathways, so we feel really good for a very, very brief period of time. And in that moment, it feels like intimacy. but it doesn't last. It doesn't persist, right? It triggers all the same kind of pathways that actual love does, but with none of the good stuff. So there's this intense high and a severe drop-off, followed by guilt and shame, which makes me more depressed, which makes me more likely to act out, which makes it more likely I'm not ever going to tell anybody about this because it's super embarrassing. So it becomes very addictive very quickly. A lot of pastors are succumbing, and my experience with pastors has been where shame and guilt are an issue, and if we add loneliness and isolation, it's kind of this perfect scene in which that can happen. And it is a very depressive syndrome. Yeah. Did I answer the question? Now I got to check every time. Okay, good. Thank you for asking that. Anyone else?
Yeah, right. So you made a statement that when somebody goes through one stage of depression, they're a lot more likely to go through 2 or 3 more in the future.
Seasons, yes.
Yeah, seasons. So how would you go about caring and ministering to somebody who's gone through one season and they're really prone to slipping back into it? How would you?
It's a great question. That's well done by a college student. That's a pretty articulate question there. Way to go. So part of it is helping all of us educate ourselves, right? So we want people to be more aware of signs and symptoms, right? So I can be more educated myself. So I'm hyper-tuned personally to melancholy. I know when it's coming my way, but I'm a student of psychology and ministry, right? So not everybody's a student of psychology and ministry. So absent education or continuing education about our own selves and our emotional life, connections with people, right? Intimacy reduces almost always some of the intensity in anxiety and depression. We want people in relationship. The problem when you're depressed is all you want to do is hide in the cave, right? We want a bunker. So we want people followed up on when they're missing. We want people in connections. We want people ministering, right? One of the quickest ways to improve our self-esteem is to care for another, right? If there's a hack in social science research about self-esteem, it's not giving people more trophies, it's engaging in altruistic love. Imagine that. A biblical concept in the social sciences, right? So being less self-focused, being in relationship, being in connections, because it is fragile. Like if you've been through a really serious season, we want to help people not do that again. So lots of support, connection, ministry opportunities. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Great question. Extra credit, whatever classes you're in, extra credit. You're welcome, faculty. Wow, look, all the students have questions now.
I'm interested in, you have these nasty 9 things. Do you have like a proposal or thoughts on what you would share with senior pastors or elder staffs to like, hey, here's how to prevent some of these things, or here's where your expectations need to be kind of reined in a little bit? You have any thoughts on that?
I do, and it revolves all around soul care. So if I had a group of nothing but senior pastors and elder chairs, what I would say is the most loving thing you can do for your staff is guarantee that they have quality time off every week, every month, every quarter, and every year. If you want to keep your staff for the long haul, support them well emotionally, relationally. If they're in crisis, help. What is not helpful is working 60 hours a week indefinitely. You'll burn out your staff, and they will leave the ministry, and they will leave angry, hurt, and depressed. So if you want to keep them, help them take care of themselves, which means that senior pastors have to create boundaries for everyone, for themselves and their staff. One of the saddest memories I have as a PK is what would happen to my mom and dad at dinner time when the phone would ring at our house. This was in the 60s and 70s. The phone would invariably ring at dinner time, and my dad felt compelled to answer the phone because he felt like he was always on. And to watch the struggle with my mom, who wanted to protect dinner time because my dad worked a lot. And I remember as a kid thinking, I didn't know the word boundaries, but I remember thinking as a little boy, can't you not answer the phone sometimes? But you have to be very intentional about that, right, as a lead. You have to model it, right? We have to take better care of ourselves. All of us. Me too. Yeah. That's what I would really focus on, is that soul care piece. And then let me add, so the second thing I would do is I would set up a toll-free, get out of jail, no questions asked back door for pastors that need counseling. You don't tell me the issue, you just tell me you need to go and we'll pay for it. If the church could afford that, I would recommend that highly. That you set aside some funds, and if you ask people in the church to give to it, people will give to that. We're going to set up a self-care fund for the pastors. We don't want to get them burned out. No questions asked. If you need to go to a professional Christian therapist, we'll just make that happen. That'd be harder for a small church, but yep. And then I would do everything I could to make sure that whatever I say in that setting, make sure it never gets over to this setting. So it's totally safe. Yeah, good question.
So you mentioned when we did like the taking our own test, and then we were like identifying 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned 2 weeks of feeling that way. In some of my friend groups, and myself included, it may be 5 of those, but it isn't 2 weeks of time. But it's like a full day, but it's like clockwork every other week or every 2 weeks. Is that a pattern as well, or?
So there are all sorts of variations in anxiety and depression, and one of these variations is kind of a subchronic, right, subcritical, but repetitive, right, this episodic and repetitive. A lot of pastors have it on Mondays. Some have it on Saturdays, right? Anticipatory anxiety and dread that comes from performing, right, or just predictable exhaustion. If you're not hitting 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and it's not 2 weeks, it's less critical statistically, but it still hurts, right? It's still uncomfortable. So the same principles all apply. Is I need to analyze it, I need to think about it, I need to see if I can figure out what some of the antecedents are. Like, so what's happening before? Is it a thought? Is it a behavior? Is it interactions? Is it time of month, time of week, time of day? Is it seasonal? So if I lived here, I would struggle with the gray skies. So I grew up in Southern California. I don't do well with gray, right? So is it seasonal? I did a seminar last week up in Portland, and Portland just got listed as the most depressed city in America and took over Seattle's spot. And man, I'm talking to a group of pastors up in Portland, and that's hard up there. They were all excited about the weather, and there was like a little patch of blue sky. It's like, oh, the weather's so great. And I thought, is it? Is it great? So what is the pattern? Can I begin to identify things that are setting it off? And then most importantly, can I do something about it? So it's still important. It's not as technically, categorically critical. And the reason the 2 weeks matters is because it correlates with brain research. So why 14 days? Because once we've been depressed for 14 days, the brain gets much less resilient in mood management. We don't know why. That's just how God made our brains, right? That our brains become much less resilient after 2 weeks. So if you're bummed out for 3 days, I wouldn't worry. If you're bummed out for 10 days, if you're depressed for 10 days, now I start to really pay attention to that, because we don't want to get past 14, 15, 16 days. But everybody gets bummed out for a day or two from time to time. Doesn't mean it's fantastic. I mean, nobody likes being depressed for a day. Back to the cyclical thing, I think it is a real issue for a lot of pastors, the kind of the weekly rhythm and the adrenaline letdown of preaching. If you're speaking and teaching 2, 3, 4 times, do you guys feel it after? Yeah. Yeah, somebody had a, okay.
So, quick question. It's going to be kind of 2 in 1. So
Okay.
I think one of the really important of the nasty 9 is that isolation, that loneliness.
Yeah.
So if you have a church that has a big, say Calvary, that has a lot of pastors, how can you intentionally, as one of those pastors, seek out your coworkers to help prevent that isolation, prevent that loneliness from kicking in and dragging them down, number 1. And then 2, if you are a pastor and you're it,
Yeah.
if it's just you, how do you make sure that that is not something that continues? Because as a hero or as somebody who's always giving, it's hard to ask for those individuals.
Yeah. So let's talk about the 2 settings. So if one is the big setting with lots of players, right? Well, I want both sides of the equation more real with each other. So the pastor who's concerned, I want to move closer to people and go, hey, how are you doing? How are you really doing? Let's spend some time together and talk about that and make it as safe as possible. If I'm the other side of the fence and I'm starting to struggle, I need to pick somebody on staff that's going to take care of me and not rat me out. I'm not going to get demoted or marginalized or in trouble somehow. I need to find a safe person on staff. Most staffs have a pretty safe Sherpa or pastor that does soul care for others, whether they're in that position or not, right? So both people need to seek each other out in a safe way. It's harder for the pastor in a little town at a little church who's on their own, but I still recommend connections. So another pastor in town, and there are some new networks that are beginning to emerge of pastor resource groups that are online cohorts that are specifically doing things around soul care. There's a new group out of Portland that I just learned about. Clark Tanner is the gentleman's name up there that runs a support network for people just like this that are in isolated settings. And they can be in a cohort and they can talk safely with each other and support each other. But I would do whatever it takes to not feel so alone. So I would fight the urge to bunker. And I use that word a lot because if you've never been depressed, it is one of our reflexive solutions is to just isolate. And you have to fight against that. Is that? I'm not doing well in this zone right here. So ask again since I didn't answer it.
No, you did. Is it possible for, especially in that more soul pastor role, is it possible for those relationships to happen within the church at all?
So I think it's hit and miss. And I think it's because we're getting paychecks from the place that is supposed to also be pastoring us. I think some churches have a culture. So there's a church in Vegas, a large-ish church in Vegas, where the culture of that church is soul care for everyone, including the pastors. There's another church that I work with where it is a corporate, type A, produce church. It's not very safe in that corporate environment to hold your hand up and say, I'm hurting. It's extremely safe in this church over here in Vegas. So in this other church where it's less safe, people have to, it takes them longer to find out who can I trust, right? And that's all driven from the top. Is the lead team needs to decide if we're going to have a safe place or not for pastors. Obviously, I have an inclination that it'd be really helpful if we had a safe place to be pastors. But one of our fears on the people management side is, well, we don't want to take our foot off the gas and have everybody just sitting around talking about their feelings all the time. We won't get anything done, right? We won't be doing kingdom work. Well, here's what we find. When we actually allow people to slow down a little bit, they actually get more fruitful in their work, right? So when Google first started, they changed the work world by giving people margin to do things that were fun at their work. As they became bigger and more successful, they started reducing that margin, and now their employees act like everybody else. They don't love their jobs most of the time. When we give people margin, they flourish. So we're worried that people are just going to take advantage of it, and they really don't. By and large, they really don't. Okay. Last one? Okay.
Yeah, good job, by the way.
Thank you very much. As a hero child, I really appreciate that.
Do you know the percentage of hospital chaplains that go through depression?
I have not read any research on that group. I'll look it up and see if I can find some. I have talked to a few chaplains over the last year. First responder chaplains and hospital chaplains, I think, see more difficult things than average pastors. I would imagine because of that. It's like being a first responder when you hear first responder stories or hear medical trauma. They're probably susceptible to maybe higher than normal levels of depression and anxiety would be my guess. I was talking to an Army chaplain at Spire, and he was telling me about a typical day in his work as an Army chaplain, and I thought, I'm depressed just hearing about it because he's hearing about all these very difficult war stories. And if you're hearing about medical trauma, it's probably a little bit higher risk group. And one of the things we know about those kind of jobs is you have to ventilate that material. If you're a chaplain if you're a police officer, if you're a first responder, if you're doing ride-alongs someday, right, you have to talk about that. If you store it away, it's always going to come out some other way down the road. So we have to be really intentional about processing that material. Is that it? All right. Hey, I want to thank you for allowing us to do this. We will talk about the possibility of maybe coming back and doing something with soul care. My final word is this. If you have been struggling with depression or anxiety and you've not brought it into the light of relationships, I want to challenge you as your brother in Christ to take that to someone, to a friend, to a counselor, to a doctor, and just take that first step, okay? Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. Have a great day.